Somewhere in Phoenix, Arizona, on a warm June evening in 1992, a girl stepped into the night. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't angry. She wasn't running away. 15-year-old Melody Harrison stepped out of her home, her shadow stretching long under the dim streetlights. She was just a girl walking into the night, a night she would never walk out of. No one saw where she went. No one heard her scream. 1 second, she was there. The next, she was a ghost. And the world didn't even blink. Her mother, Susan Harrison, had always feared something like this. You know how mothers are. They just know. Melody was her baby, her shy, artistic, beautiful girl, the one who still giggled when they had movie nights, the one who doodled in the margins of her notebooks, the one who promised she'd be home by curfew. But midnight came, then 2 a.m., then 6, and Melody's bed, still empty. That's when the fear set in, the kind that wraps itself around your throat and doesn't let go. Susan called her friends. No answer. She called the police. And what did they say? She probably ran away. She'll be back when she gets bored. Teenagers do this all the time. But Melody wasn't like other teenagers. She didn't drink. She didn't party. She didn't disappear without a word. And yet, the police treated her like just another runaway statistic. No urgency, no search teams. Just a case number scribbled on a report that no one would read. And Susan? She was left alone. Alone with a missing daughter. Alone with a silence that felt like a coffin being nailed shut. 48 hours. That's all the time you have before a missing person case turns cold. Before the trail goes dead. Before the world stops caring. Before a mother has to face the worst thought imaginable. Her child is never coming home. But Susan wouldn't accept that. So she searched. She drove through the city, screaming Melody's name into the darkness. She knocked on doors, plastered missing posters on every street corner, begged strangers to look at her daughter's face. But people just glanced, nodded, walked away. Because to them, Melody was just another girl on a piece of paper, just another face they'd forget. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Melody's name? It vanished, just like she did. The missing posters faded. The police moved on. Even the people who promised to help stopped calling. But Susan, she never moved on. Because a mother doesn't forget. A mother knows when something is wrong, knows when the world is lying, knows when her child is gone. But what Susan didn't know, what no one knew, was that out there, beyond the city lights, buried in the endless, merciless desert, Melody's story wasn't over. Because the truth? It was still waiting to be found. Susan Harrison never stopped searching. Not after the first day. Not after the first week. Not after the police stopped answering her calls. She walked the streets with Melody's picture, shoving it into strangers' hands. Please, have you seen her? Some nodded, pretending to care. Some didn't even look at her. And the worst ones, the ones who said, she's probably just another runaway. As if that made it okay. As if that made her less worth saving. But Susan, she knew her daughter. Melody wasn't some troubled kid looking for an escape. She had dreams. She had a life waiting for her. And most of all, she had a mother who would never believe she left by choice. The police took a report. They wrote down Melody's name. And then, they put it in a drawer filled with other names, other girls, other cases that no one cared to solve. No evidence, no witnesses, no urgency, just silence. For weeks, Susan called the station every day, and every day she got the same answer. We're doing what we can. But she could hear the truth in their voices. They weren't looking. They never were. Because in their eyes, Melody was already gone. Back home, Melody's room stayed exactly the same. The covers still pulled up, the closet still full of clothes she never got to wear again. A half-empty soda can still sitting on her desk, the last thing she touched before she disappeared. Susan would sit on the edge of the bed at night, fingers brushing over Melody's pillow, eyes staring at the door, waiting. Because what if? What if Melody walked through that door right now? What if it was all a mistake? What if this was just a terrible nightmare? But the door never opened, and every night the silence felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath, like it knew she wasn't coming back. Susan begged the local news to cover Melody's story. Most ignored her. One small reporter finally agreed to meet. They sat in a tiny, greasy diner. Susan slid Melody's photo across the table. Her voice cracked. She was just a kid. How does a child disappear and no one cares? The reporter listened. They wrote a short article. It made page 5. And by the next day, it was already forgotten. Just like Melody. Just like every other girl who vanished into thin air. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. And the flyers, the ones with Melody's face, they started peeling off the poles. The ink bled in the sun. The paper curled at the edges. One by one, they disappeared, just like her. And the world moved on. Another girl gone. Another mother grieving. Another name whispered into the wind, waiting to be remembered. But no one was listening, because Melody Harrison was just another forgotten girl. Except to Susan. To Susan, she was everything, and she would never stop searching, even if she was searching alone. The Arizona desert isn't kind. It doesn't forgive. It swallows things whole, secrets, sins, and people. Some are buried by time. Others, they are left for the sun to claim. August 1992. Two hikers, a father and son, took a trail they had walked dozens of times before. A weekend tradition. Until today. Because today, something felt wrong. A smell. Foul. Thick. The kind that lingers in the back of your throat and tells you that something shouldn't be here. They followed it. Through dry brush and scattered rocks, until they saw it. At first, it looked like trash. Something dumped, half buried by the wind. But when the father stepped closer, his breath hitched, and his stomach turned. A body, or what was left of one. Bones, tangled in fabric, sun-bleached, scattered. A skull tilted on its side, as if watching them. The boy whispered, "Dad?" The father grabbed his son's hand, and they ran. The sheriff's department arrived an hour later, a handful of deputies sweltering in the heat. The body had been out here for weeks, maybe months. There was no ID, no purse, no wallet, just the brutal, unwavering desert. The lead investigator barely looked up from his notepad. "Jane Doe," he muttered. Another one. Another set of bones in the sun. The official cause of death? Undetermined. The unofficial cause? No one really cared enough to find out. A crime? Maybe. Or maybe just another runaway who met the wrong person at the wrong time, in the wrong place. She was bagged, tagged, and placed in storage, filed away under a number instead of a name. And the world moved on. But across the city, Melody's mother. She hadn't moved on. She still waited by the phone. She still left the porch light on. She still believed. Because no one told her not to. The police had stopped calling. The flyers had started peeling off telephone poles. The news stations had moved on to fresher tragedies. But she held on. Because what if Melody was still out there? What if she was cold, hungry? What if she was waiting for her mother to find her? Because the alternative. It wasn't something a mother could bear. The body in the desert. It sat in a cold storage locker, waiting for a name. But no one was looking. Not really. The DNA testing of 1992 wasn't like today. There were no databases, no fast matches. And without an ID, without someone demanding answers, a girl could stay Jane Doe forever. And so she did. The years ticked by, and Melody Harrison, the girl who was once so full of life, so bright, so loved, became nothing more than a file, a forgotten case, a missing person that no one was missing anymore. At the Harrison house, Melody's chair was never pulled away from the table. Her birthday cake was still made, though no one dared touch it. Her Christmas stocking was still hung, though it remained empty. And every time the phone rang, her mother's heart leapt. Maybe, just maybe, this time it was Melody. But it never was. It was just time, mocking her. The world had stopped asking about Melody. The headlines had moved on. Even the police had long since closed their notebooks. But Melody's mother, she never stopped waiting for her little girl to walk through that door. She kept her bedroom exactly the same. The posters of boy bands still clung to the walls, their faces faded with time. The stuffed animals sat neatly on the bed, untouched, gathering dust. And every time she passed that room, she had to remind herself not to call out her daughter's name. Because Melody was not there. She had never been there. Not in 31 years. For years, her mother's voice rang out on the other end of a phone line, calling detectives, calling reporters, calling anyone who would listen. My daughter is still missing. Please, just look again. She didn't run away. And every time, the same hollow, rehearsed responses. We don't have any new leads. We'll keep the file open. Sometimes kids leave and don't want to be found. They made it sound like Melody had a choice, like she was somewhere out there, living a new life, refusing to come home. Like she wasn't a 15-year-old girl who had vanished into thin air. And when the phone calls stopped getting returned, that's when the real silence began. While Melody's mother begged for answers, Melody was waiting. Not in some faraway city, not in some new life, but in a box. A cold steel box in an evidence room, labelled Jane Doe, number 127. Her body had been found 2 months after she disappeared, left in the Arizona desert, alone, abandoned. But no one knew it was her. No one even thought to check. So she became just another nameless girl, and the case was closed before it even began. Her mother still prayed for a phone call, still sat by the window, waiting for news, still hoped. All while Melody's bones gathered dust in a storage locker, less than an hour away from home. The years wore down her mother like waves against stone. The lines on her face deepened, her hair greyed, her voice, once so loud, so determined, began to fade. Hope started to feel like a curse, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw Melody, her little girl, her baby, still 15th, still smiling, still missing, and the ache of not knowing was worse than death itself, because at least with death, there is an answer. At least with death, there is an ending. But for 31 years, there was only silence, and silence is the loudest kind of pain. It took 3 decades for someone to ask the right question, for technology to catch up, for DNA to finally whisper the truth. Melody had been there, all along, waiting. But by then, it was too late. Too late for her mother to hold her. Too late for one last goodbye. Too late for justice. Because time had stolen everything. Everything except one thing. The only thing her mother had ever wanted. The truth. For 31 years, Melody Harrison's name faded into the background of an unsolved case file. Her mother held on to hope, but hope can be a cruel thing. It keeps you awake at night, whispering that maybe, just maybe, today is the day she'll come home. But the world moved on. No search teams, no breaking news segments, no justice, just another missing girl in a forgotten folder. Until, in a quiet forensic lab, Science decided it wasn't finished with Melody yet. Somewhere in a brightly lit laboratory, surrounded by cold metal tables and humming computers, a forensic technician stared at an old set of remains. Bones. That's all Melody had become. No name, no face, just a case number on a report. But this technician, this stranger who had never met her, refused to let that be her final story. "You were someone," they whispered under their breath. "Let's find out who." And then they got to work. It started with a swab of old bone dust, a careful extraction, a process that felt almost sacred. Because DNA doesn't lie, it doesn't forget, it doesn't care how much time has passed. And now, with genealogy testing, forensic scientists could do something impossible. Trace a nameless body to a family that had spent 3 decades waiting for answers. The machine hummed, numbers crunched, data processed, and then a result. A name, one that had been missing for far too long. It was an ordinary day in 2023, the kind of day where nothing seems special, where life goes on even when you don't want it to. Then the phone rang. A family member, tired, weary, answered. "Hello?" A pause. Then a voice, steady but heavy, carrying the weight of impossible news. "We found her." Silence. A trembling breath. A heartbeat skipping, then racing. What did you say?" They repeated. Slowly. Like breaking glass, the reality of those words shatters everything. Melody was never coming home, not in the way they had dreamed. But at least now they could stop searching. At least now the wondering was over. At least now she had a name again. People think closure is some magical thing, that once you have it, the pain goes away, that the grief softens, that it all starts to make sense. But here's the truth. Closure doesn't erase the years stolen. It doesn't bring back the birthdays she missed, the graduations she never got, the future she was supposed to have. It just closes the book on one question, while leaving 1,000 more unanswered. Who did this? Why? Could it have been prevented? For her mother? For her family? It was a relief, yes, but also a fresh kind of heartbreak. Because now there was no more what if, only what was. For 31 years, Melody Harrison was a nameless ghost, a lost girl in a desert grave. But now she had her name back. Now she was more than Jane Doe, number 127. Now the world was forced to remember. The machines in that forensic lab didn't just identify her. They gave her a voice. They pulled her out of the shadows. And they whispered to the world. She was here. She mattered. And she was loved. The family sits in silence, staring at the girl frozen in time. Melody Harrison, forever 15 years old. Her mother reaches for a photo, her hands shaking. It's the same one she's held 1,000 times. Melody at her last birthday, blowing out candles, eyes full of life, making a wish. What had she wished for? Did she ever imagine that she'd never make it to 16? The thought is unbearable. Her mother's voice is barely a whisper. She should have been 46 this year. The weight of those words hangs in the air, suffocating. Because Melody's life ended, but time didn't stop for anyone else. The world moved on. The seasons changed. People forgot. But not her family. Never her family. For 31 years, they asked the same question. Where is she? Now, they finally have an answer. But instead of relief, there's only more agony. Now they ask, how did she die? Did she cry out for help? Was she afraid? Did she suffer? Was she alone? Because people don't just end up in the desert. Somebody put her there. Somebody stole her life. Somebody knows what happened. And for 3 decades, that somebody has been walking free. Maybe they've built a life, started a family. Maybe they have children Melody's age. Maybe they pass her mother in the grocery store, never giving a second thought to the nightmare they left behind. The idea makes her mother sick. Melody never got to grow up. But the person who did this, they did. And they got away with it. Phoenix, 1992. Melody wasn't the first to go missing, and she wouldn't be the last. It was a time when monsters roamed the streets, serial killers, predators, men who hunted, and the world let them. Because Melody wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, she was just a girl who walked out of her house and never came back. And when she disappeared, the city barely blinked. The news barely ran her story. The police? They called her a runaway. And when a girl is labeled a runaway, people stop looking. They stop caring. But what if Melody hadn't run? What if someone had taken her? And what if her name should have been on a list of victims, ones whose deaths were no accident? The thought is chilling. That Melody's killer might not have been a stranger. Maybe it was someone who knew her. Maybe it was someone who had done this before. Because there were others. Girls who disappeared. Bodies that turned up in the desert. Cases that went cold. And there was one name that haunted investigators. The baseline killer. A man who preyed on Phoenix women, kidnapping, assaulting, and murdering them. Could he have taken Melody? Or was there someone else? Someone who was never caught? Because the truth is, Phoenix in the early 90s was a hunting ground. And the girls? They were prey. The box of evidence is thin. Too thin. A missing persons report. A few interviews. And then, nothing. Because back then, nobody fought for Melody. Nobody saw her story as urgent. And now, 31 years later, detectives have to start from scratch. The leads are cold. The witnesses are gone. The memories are faded. And the only person who knows the full truth? They're still out there, living their life. While Melody's was left to rot in the desert. Investigators want to make it right. But can they? Can they really find a killer 3 decades later? Or is it too late? The Harrison family doesn't want revenge. They don't want blood. They just want the truth. Because Melody's story was never supposed to end like this. Abandoned, unanswered, forgotten. Her mother grips the photograph tighter. She was just a kid. She deserved more than this. And for the first time in 31 years, maybe, just maybe, someone is finally listening. A soft glow flickers in the darkness. One by one, flames dance to life, held by trembling hands. A sea of candles, their golden light reflecting in tear-filled eyes. At the center of it all, a framed photo of Melody Harrison. Her young face, forever 15, smiles back from behind the glass. Surrounded by flowers, notes, stuffed animals, offerings of love, of sorrow, of a grief that never faded. Her family stands close, hands clasped, shoulders shaking. After 31 years, they are finally able to say goodbye. But it doesn't feel like closure. Not yet. Not when her killer still walks free. Her mother steps forward. Her voice is raw, thick with pain and love and the unbearable weight of time. For so long, I held on to hope. I told myself, one day she'd walk through that door. One day, I'd hear her voice again. She chokes back a sob, pressing a hand to her mouth. The silence is heavy, crushing. That day never came. Her father grips her shoulder, his own eyes red, swollen. Her brother, now a grown man, wipes away a tear, remembering the little sister he lost. Because the world moved on. But they never did. Every birthday, an empty chair. Every Christmas, one less stocking. Every single day, the ache of not knowing. Until now. Until the phone call that shattered their last fragile piece of hope. We found her. Melody was never coming home. Because she had been alone in the desert for 3 decades. For years, Melody was just a nameless set of bones. A Jane Doe, lost in a filing cabinet, forgotten by the world. Until forensic genealogy stepped in. Until strangers, scientists, volunteers, people who never knew her, refused to let her name stay buried. They took what little remained. They extracted DNA. They searched and searched and searched. And then, a match. Science did what investigators couldn't. It brought Melody back to her family. It gave her name back. And now it's doing the same for others. Her mother looks out at the crowd, faces illuminated by candlelight. Some are strangers. Some are families still waiting for their own lost loved ones to come home. There are thousands of Jane Does still out there. Thousands of families still waiting. And someone, somewhere, always knows something. Her voice shakes, but she forces the words out. If you know something, say something. Because silence kills. Because apathy buries the truth. Because every missing person deserves to be found. The crowd stands in solemn silence as the wind rustles the flowers at Melody's memorial. A voice whispers, "Rest in peace, Melody. A life stolen. A girl forgotten by the world. But not anymore. Not tonight. Rest in peace, Melody Harrison. You are not forgotten." If you were moved by Melody's story, if you felt her mother's pain, her family's loss, the unbearable weight of waiting, then don't let her be forgotten. Like, comment, share. Because every share keeps her story alive. Every like tells the world she mattered. Every comment pushes for justice, for Melody, and for the thousands still waiting to be found. Her face remains on the screen a moment longer. The music fades, leaving behind only silence. Then, the screen fades to black, and Melody's name appears one last time. Rest in peace, Melody Harrison. You are not forgotten.